When talking about misconceptions, we like to reference this quote. If you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So, this just reiterates the idea that it is a spectrum disorder, and it's really important that we don't just classify individuals as being the same just because they have autism. So, let's look at some data. Currently, 1 in 36 children are identified as being on the autism spectrum. What's really important to know about that specific statistic is that that number is getting smaller and smaller every single year. So the likelihood that you work with a student with autism is increasing yearly. We also know that it is 4 times more common in boys than it is girls. We're not quite sure why that is. We don't know if that's because of diagnostics or other factors that play into it. But autism does not discriminate. It is prevalent in all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups. And we're not quite sure what the cause is of autism. However, it has been linked to genetics and environmental factors. So, next, we're going to talk about the 3 levels of autism. The 3 levels kind of level out autism for us, so when we as educators go to work with certain students, we know how to best support them based on the common characteristics that are most prevalent with that student. So, yes, we did say that autism presents differently with each individual, but what this kind of does is takes those common characteristics of autism and separates them out so we are able to provide the best resources for them. So our level 1 students are going to be our individuals that require some support or just a little more support than their typically developing peers. This might look like some social awkwardness, or they might have difficulty initiating social interactions. They might also need some support in the area of executive functioning, so helping them figure out when to turn things in, how to keep their desks organized or their backpacks clean. This is going to be more of our learners that can be really benefited from a visual support or a visual schedule, but for the most part, they're pretty independent. You don't have to be right next to them all the time. Level 2 are our learners that need moderate support. Their social interactions might be narrowed to those specific or perseverative interests. So, for example, if you have a student who really likes bugs, they might initiate conversation and have that need or want for friendships, but they don't know how to talk about anything else other than what they really, really like, which is bugs. So they might need more support in knowing what to talk about or how to have a full conversation with somebody else. You might need to teach them how to initiate a conversation, but also how to end a conversation, and how to have empathy or take interest in what somebody else is saying. You might also start to see more frequent restrictive or repetitive behaviors. So that might look like their stimming behaviors. So this could present like hand flapping or rocking or vocal stems even. That can look a bunch of different ways, and we're going to get into that a little bit more. But that is level 2. Level 3 are learners that need substantial support. So they might have severe communication challenges, meaning that they might not have speaking language. They might use alternative communication like an AAC device or PECS. Their receptive language might be delayed, so they might need a few more prompts or different kinds of prompts to be able to understand what's being asked of them. And they might have difficulty changing actions or focus. They might have really big reactions when their schedules are thrown off, or not be able to focus in on a task for more than just a few minutes. So, this is going to be our learners who really need somebody to guide them in the direction, especially in a school setting. But looking at some overall common characteristics, that might look like social and communication deficits or delays. So, again, maybe some delays receptively or expressively using alternative methods of communication. They might be hyper or hyposensitive to sensory input. So, they might not like really bright lights or loud noises, or they might need some joint compression squeezes or really like sensory input. They might have difficulty developing and maintaining relationships. So we talked about that social awkwardness. So not really knowing how to initiate conversations or end conversations. They might not know body proximity or even how to talk about something that's not of interest to them. You'll start to see those stemming behaviors, such as turning lights on and off. We talked about hand flapping or rocking, maybe even visual stems. There's all different kinds of stemming or restrictive or repetitive behaviors, but those can start to become more noticeable than in typically developing peers. You might see students with perseverative interests. So we talked about our student who might really like bugs, but a lot of students really like trains or cars or airplanes. I had a student who really liked vacuums and trash cans. So perseverative interests aren't a bad thing. We all have things that we really, really like, but specifically with students with autism, this is something that they almost are hyper fixated on. And then the need for routine and structure. They really have big reactions, or they don't have typical reactions if their schedule is changed. They really attach themselves to that sameness. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at eligibility versus diagnosis. So we're going to look at the DSM-5 versus what DESE has to say about autism specifically. So one thing to know is that when we're looking at the DSM-5 and their definition, they really make it a point to say autism spectrum disorder, whereas DESE kind of just says autism. It doesn't have to be autism spectrum disorder. So if you want to pause here, this is where the DSM talks about those restrictive or repetitive behaviors and what those might look like, or what the student or individual has to qualify for as far as medical diagnosis. And then this is where the DSM discusses the student's social capabilities, whether they're able to relate to people or objects or events, things like that. So this is where the DSM-5 says you might see some of these characteristics in the early developmental period. However, keep in mind that certain individuals with autism tend to mask, which I think of as camouflage. So they kind of put that mask on to look like everyone else, to act like everyone else. They start to model after everyone else. So you might not see some of these characteristics until later in life. This also might be the case if the social demands exceed the limited capacity. So what that means is you might not see this later until social demands are too much and the student has autism, so they're not quite sure how to respond anymore. They have that limited capacity. So then that again would be a reason why you wouldn't see this necessarily in that developmental early period. This is where DESE starts to talk about how all of these characteristics can be common with autism. However, for DESE to be eligible educationally, it has to adversely affect the student's educational performance. So this is when both DESE and DSM say, hey, this can't be classified as anything else. So this is autism spectrum disorder, or this is autism in the educational arena. So the DSM just straight up says, hey, this can't be classified as an intellectual disability or something else. It's its own thing. And this is where DESE says, if they have two or more of these things, it can be classified as autism. So this is where the DSM and DESE kind of go through and talk about what qualifies as autism or autism spectrum disorder. So the DSM says we have hundreds of different diagnoses that can differentiate autism spectrum disorder, and that's how you know that it's autism in comparison to other diagnoses. Whereas DESE says we have 13 possible categories, and these indicators can differentiate that it's autism, and therefore you can receive special education services through that. You don't have to have a medical diagnosis to receive that autism eligibility. So that's the biggest difference. So again, some reminders. Educational eligibility is not the same as a diagnosis. So if you're receiving services, or you have a student that receives services for the category of autism, that's not the same as having autism. But you do not need that diagnosis to receive the services under the category of autism. A medical diagnosis requires specific characteristics to be shown that are universal amongst students or individuals with autism, and that can be also transferable to two eligibility criteria for special services. But thoughtful collections of medical records, family records, educational history, all of that has to be a part of both evaluations. So, regardless of whether you're educationally eligible or you have a medical diagnosis, a thorough evaluation needs to be done for both. Okay, so now we're going to dive deeper into the characteristics of autism. So, we're going to look at speech, language, and communication, as well as how people with autism relate to events and other people and objects, things like that. So, there's going to be a list of videos following this one. I want you to watch the videos, take note, and then come back here and we're going to discuss.